Hello, and thank you for choosing this clean historical Western romance by Emma Ashwood. Before we begin, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Your support allows us to keep sharing more wonderful stories for free. So grab a cozy spot, kick back, and let this story whisk you away to a different time and place. Enjoy. Copyright Emma Ashwood. Fleeing to Freedom by Emma Ashwood. Chapter 1. New York City. 3rd of June, 1855. Eleanor Kirby swept her long blonde hair from her beautiful face, turning to look when she heard a knock on her bedroom door. At age 19, she liked to have her privacy, but often found that almost impossible with her stepfather around, even with her door closed. He liked to know where she was and what was doing at all times. Then she recalled he had never even had the grace to knock, so she knew it could not be him. "Come in," she called, her voice gentle as her soul and a small smile on her ruby-red lips, which broadened as the door opened, and she saw her mother, Elizabeth Seymour, standing on the threshold. Eleanor beckoned her in by holding out her hand, which her mother gratefully accepted. "My darling Eleanor," she began, her bright blue eyes brimming with tears. "I don't know what else I can do to prevent this terrible marriage that Donald has arranged for you," she said desperately. Eleanor stood and maneuvered the pair until her mother had taken the seat she had abandoned on the ornate, dark wood chair at the vanity table. Eleanor sighed and tried to smile at her mother to reassure her, but she too was worried about what would become of her. Eleanor's father had died when she was just 6 years old. Her memories of him had faded over the years, but what little she did still remember was only good. She knew he had been a good and honorable man. Her mother had been distraught when he had passed and had quickly found herself in financial difficulty. As a consequence, Elizabeth Kirby had become Elizabeth Seymour after marrying Donald through sheer desperation and the need to keep food on the table for herself and her daughter. He had seemed like a safe bet to Elizabeth at the time, but that couldn't have been further from reality. As the years went by, Donald had turned into a controlling and dominating man. Elizabeth soon realized she had made the wrong decision in marrying the businessman, but it had been too late for her to change that by the time she knew the character of the man. "We will figure something out, Mother. Try not to worry. It will all be all right in the end." "He can't force me to marry someone I don't know, surely," Eleanor replied, holding back her own tears and wondering if he actually could force that upon her. She and her mother had become accustomed to the moderate wealth they had access to within Donald's family, so Elizabeth had always been careful not to rock the boat. They were not rich by any means. They had one maid and a cook who helped in the home, which was significantly lacking compared to their lifestyle when Eleanor's father had been alive. That was before the state had heartlessly taken all they could when he died, leaving a bereaved widow and her daughter to find an alternative life for themselves. Eleanor had moments of bitterness when she thought about this time. She barely remembered it, but she could well imagine how hard it must have been for her mother, such an impossible situation to find herself in. She marveled at how well her mother coped during that time and how she saved them from a far worse life. Donald may have become hard to live with, but they knew they still needed to be grateful for him taking them in when they were at their lowest. "That's just it. He wants you to meet the man. He wants you to get to know him," her mother gasped, fear etched in her eyes. Donald was a businessman who was always going from one project to another. He had as many failures as he did successes, but it never deterred him, and he was always looking for the next big deal that would come his way and make him a fortune. When Eleanor turned 19, this next big deal had reared its head in the shape of an almost 50-year-old minor business associate. Grant Turner had offered a life-changing deal if Donald would allow him to take Eleanor as his wife. Eleanor's stepfather had announced this shortly after her birthday with genuine excitement, and was shocked and angered when the two women had not shared his enthusiasm over the prospect. Eleanor had noticed her mother shake her head very slightly at that time, which she knew meant that she should stay quiet for now. She had obeyed immediately. the two women knowing when to be still around Donald Seymour, who could easily become a danger. "I don't know what to do," Elizabeth said quietly as she allowed the tears to flow down her pale cheeks. "I will put it off. I will hold them off as long as I can. Try not to worry, Mother. I don't want you to be sad," Eleanor replied earnestly, searching her mother's eyes for agreement. She was worried that her mother would stand up to her husband, and she knew what this could lead to. Suddenly, Elizabeth jumped to her feet. She wiped her eyes and cheeks to ensure no sign of tears remained, and she straightened her dress, holding her head high. Eleanor had seen this look before and was immediately worried for her mother. "Look at you reassuring me. I am the mother in this relationship. I need to sort this out once and for all," she declared as she stalked from her bedroom. Eleanor wanted to call after her, but she knew that if Donald thought they had been conspiring against him, the consequences would be severe. So she stayed quiet and prayed silently that her mother would calm down and come to her senses before she confronted her husband. Sure enough, within only a few moments, Eleanor could hear muffled voices, one pleading desperately, whilst the other shouted angrily in retaliation. She wanted to rush down the stairs and save her mother from his no doubt harsh words, but she knew from experience that this would only make it worse for her mother. She held her breath and listened. Finally, she heard the sounds which she had expected at some point. She heard her mother's cries of pain, and then she heard her mother retreating up the stairs, raising her despairing eyes just once as she passed Eleanor on her way to the marital bedroom. Eleanor noticed her wince in pain with each step. She noticed how her mother held her waist with her free hand, the other on the banister for support. She noticed the bruise forming over her mother's right eye. When Elizabeth closed her bedroom door silently, so too did Eleanor. She sat on her bed and cried for her mother and what she had to endure with this man. And she cried for herself and what she might have to endure from the man she was set to marry as part of her stepfather's business deal. Chapter 2. Within just a short few weeks, Eleanor had been ordered to meet with Grant for tea after church one Sunday morning. Donald and Elizabeth would be in attendance too, of course. Donald insisted everything should be proper and above board, which Eleanor found to be quite absurd under the circumstances. She had feared the moment, but arrive it did, and she had awoken that morning with fear and sickness in the pit of her stomach. She wanted to look brave for the sake of her mother, but felt anything but brave. Donald had chosen what she would wear that day, and he had insisted her mother share her makeup with her daughter for the very first time, for her to look as desirable as possible. As Elizabeth gently applied powder to her daughter's face, Eleanor tried to regulate her breathing to hide her true feelings. She reassured her mother time and again that she would be just fine, although she wasn't sure that she would. "Mother," Eleanor had chosen this time to speak with her mother about the altercation she had heard. "Are you all right? I heard what happened downstairs that night." She saw her mother flinch slightly, the memory still too vivid in her mind, perhaps. "Nothing happened, my love." Her cheeks turned a pinker shade, and she averted her eyes. Eleanor had seen the bruises through her mother's makeup in the days after, so she knew it had certainly been something, but she respected her mother's decision not to talk about it. "Well, I am sorry if I have caused any trouble at all. I promise that was never my intention, and from now on I will do what needs to be done," Eleanor promised. She had resigned herself to the fact that the only way she could protect her mother was by going through with her stepfather's plan. She would have to marry this man and make the most of her future. Eleanor had been surprised at her intended husband looking as old as he did. She knew he was almost 50, but he looked much older than her stepfather, who was a few years younger. Grant had clearly approved of Eleanor's appearance, looking her up and down quite blatantly, then nodding his approval in her stepfather's direction, who looked rather smugly from Elizabeth to Eleanor. The sharing of tea went by smoothly, with little discomfort. Grant was a talkative man, polite and well-spoken. Eleanor worked hard to talk with confidence on any subject he broached, whilst remembering her place. She received the occasional glare from Donald, along with pleading looks from her mother as she silently willed her to allow this ordeal to go by as easily as could be. Eleanor obliged. She would do anything to keep her mother safe. No sooner had the tea been depleted than the men conversed silently through their eyes and facial expressions, rose from their chairs, and excused themselves. Eleanor watched as they made their way across the street to the tavern. She feared Donald would drink too much and be intolerable that evening, but she was also glad for them to be out of their presence. "That wasn't so bad," Eleanor said to her mother, whose eyes were still set through the window and on the door where the two men had just entered the tavern. Eleanor wondered if she too was worried about her husband's demeanor when he returned later that evening. Donald was an unkind man, but this grew tenfold when he partook of liquor. Elizabeth blinked her eyes as though reminding herself where she was, bringing herself back to the present moment, and then she turned to her daughter, a small, tight, unnatural smile upon her lips. "Yes, not too bad at all. He seems like a reasonable man, but I guess you never know." Her voice trailed off as she glanced again towards the tavern. Eleanor knew her mother was at a loss as to how the man she had married had metamorphosized from a kind, gentle, and thoughtful man into this. They will now be discussing the details of the arrangement in full. "As though you are something to be sold," Elizabeth stated with disdain, her eyes brimming with unfallen tears, which threatened to leap forth and down her rosy cheeks. "I do hope I'm worth enough," Eleanor stated in an attempt at a joke that her mother did not enjoy if her serious, bemused expression was anything to go by. "You run along home. I have a few things I need to do here." A genuine, bright smile finally returned to the older woman's pretty face. "All right. Are you sure you will be fine by yourself?" she asked her mother, who nodded immediately. "I'll be glad to get home and get this makeup off," Eleanor confided, leaning in to whisper so that only her mother would hear. Her first experience with makeup gave her a restrictive feeling on her skin, like she couldn't move properly. "It feels so funny on my skin." Her mother laughed before she stood to begin her errands. "You will get used to it, my girl, especially when you get a little older and you start needing it." She winked at her daughter, who laughed. Eleanor didn't think her mother needed makeup at all. She was still a beauty at a youthful 42. Chapter 3. A few days after the meeting with Grant Turner, Eleanor sat alone in her bedroom, wondering what her life was to become, when there came a quiet knock on her door. It was so quiet, in fact, that she thought she was hearing things, so she stayed still for a moment to see if it had just been a noise in the house. A moment later, there was a quiet rap again, clearly on her door. Her stepfather would never be so calm, so she knew it must be her mother. She quickly stood and tiptoed to her door, opening it gently and carefully to avoid the usual creaks. Elizabeth tiptoed in, a finger on her lips to indicate they should be as quiet as can be. Over the previous few months since the marriage had been mentioned, Eleanor's stepfather seemingly did not want her and her mother to spend any time alone together. She suspected this was because he thought they would plot against him and find a way out of his plans. But they had never even discussed anything of the like. They both knew they could not get anything past Donald, and the consequences of being found out were just too worrisome to try to be cleverer than him. The pair met at her bed, where they sat as carefully and quietly as could be. Elizabeth held out her hands to her daughter, who took them willingly, and they looked into each other's eyes for a moment. After what seemed like an age, her mother began to whisper, "This marriage cannot go ahead, Eleanor." She paused and looked into her daughter's eyes again. "Unless you want it to, of course?" she asked cautiously. Eleanor shook her head vigorously, which her mother followed with a finger to her lips to remind her to be quiet. "I don't see any way out of it, though, Mother," Eleanor replied honestly. "I don't want to make things more difficult for you. I can do it if it means you stay safe." Tears filled her eyes at the thought of how that man treated her beloved mother. Elizabeth deserved better. They both deserved better. Elizabeth slowly drew up her skirts until she was able to reach something she had discreetly stored in the waistband. She pulled gently, and a newspaper emerged, causing Eleanor to look even more confused than she had felt about them meeting secretly. "Look at this," her mother whispered, reminding her to stay as quiet as she could, particularly now that this was out in the open. "What is it, Mother?" Eleanor asked in her hushed voice as she slowly unfolded the printed paper until she was able to read the title, The Matrimonial Times. Eleanor gasped and looked at her mother in confusion, feeling ashamed to be holding such a publication. She had heard of women going off to become mail-order brides. People around the parts where they lived referred to it as selling themselves off, and it was often implied that the men they went to were not all they portrayed in the advertisements. Eleanor could not believe she now held the newspaper in her hand. Had she not needed to be so quiet, she would have dropped it to the floor. "Listen very carefully." Her mother started. "This is how you are going to escape having to marry that dreadful Mr. Turner. We are going to find you a different husband out west. Donald has told me that he doesn't trust Mr. Turner and that he will not allow the marriage to go ahead until the business deal has gone through, which buys us some time. But it also tells us that you cannot marry this man. If Donald doesn't trust him, then he must be bad." Elizabeth looked at her daughter triumphantly through kind and loving eyes. "Mother, have you not heard what kind of men advertise in this publication? Maybe I would be safer with Mr. Turner." She sighed, ready to accept her fate. "Better the devil you know" was a quote that jumped to her mind. It's plus 7%. Much of what we hear is just hearsay, but I have heard of many ladies who have taken much time in deliberating over the advertisements, responded to one, and are now very happy with the choice they made. Some men lie as they do to our faces, too. Her mother paused and took a breath, clearly thinking of how her own husband duped her into marriage before he completely changed. But that is why you need to spend the time writing to them and getting to know them. So there really is no time to waste. Let's get to it. You need to start looking through at every chance. We are going to have to be quite surreptitious, but this is the only way. Be careful, Eleanor. If he discovers what we are doing, he will hit the roof and will surely bring the marriage forward to ensure he gets his precious business deal. If I were to be agreeable to this seemingly insane idea, what will become of you, Mother? I don't want to get you into any trouble with Donald. I have seen his nature." Eleanor spoke honestly, which made her mother blush and avert her eyes to the ground. "I will deny all knowledge. As I will be genuinely sad that you will have gone, I will easily be able to show shock and devastation that you have left. He will never suspect my involvement, and he will be too busy trying to think of a backup plan or how to find you. You will make your escape in the night, and I will discover you missing the following morning. Maybe you will leave a note for me. That would make it most convincing and less likely to lead to repercussions," she said carefully. They both knew that Donald had exerted physical violence against Elizabeth, but her mother preferred it left unspoken, which Eleanor tried to respect, even though it made her desperately sad and angry. "I don't know. This sounds ever so dangerous," Eleanor said as she slipped her finger into one of the pages and took a peek inside. This must have been what her mother had stayed in town for after their meeting with Mr. Turner to purchase this publication for her. She could only imagine the shame and worry her mother must have felt taking such a risk in her hometown. "Just take a look." "For me," her mother pleaded, "just see if anyone comes up as a prospect. It has got to be better than what you are currently faced with." Her mother stood quickly, hurried silently to the door, and opened it gently. She placed a finger to her lips one last time before she vanished beyond the door, closing it firmly but soundlessly behind her. Eleanor stayed seated on her bed, considering what had just happened and what she could be about to do. Her stomach felt funny, but in a nicer way than it did when she had met Grant Turner. This time, it was a mixture of worry and excitement, for she might be about to create her own destiny, her own future. Suddenly, though, the realization that she would not be able to see her mother dawned on her, and that possibility seemed unbearable. She would have to speak to her at the next possible opportunity about that. Maybe her mother had already thought of a way to secretly stay in touch. Eleanor listened silently for any sounds in the house. All was still. She supposed her mother had gone back up to her bedroom, and Donald was probably downstairs, in the kitchen or out on the porch, which was where he could normally be found, smoking his cigars while partaking of a whiskey or two. She laid the large paper out on her bed as quietly as she could, turning the first page with both hands. She started slowly, reading every word of every advertisement, until soon she was skipping those she had no interest in, and keeping a mental note of any she might respond to. She had decided she would look only for those who were close enough to her age and decided under 30 years old to be propitious. She wanted someone who appeared to be hardworking and kind, the traits her father had held and she respected. Page after page she read, turning the pages as quietly as she could, and then sitting silently to listen for hints of sounds in the house before she dared to read. She planned that if she heard anyone approaching, she would quickly fold the paper and secrete it under her mattress. Finally, Eleanor settled on an advertisement submitted by a man who went by the name of Bradley Brooker, a 23-year-old man in a town named Thunder Valley, of which she had never heard, but which proclaimed to be in Arizona territory. He had stated that he was keen to start a family, which he felt, as an ambitious copper miner, to be ready to support. What more could Eleanor hope for, she thought. He seemed on paper to be hardworking and set to be a family man. Chapter 4. The following morning over breakfast, Eleanor met her mother's eyes and tried to indicate that she would need to see her alone. Her mother miraculously showed a slight nod of her head to indicate that somehow understood. Donald glared at them as he took his place at the table expectantly, waiting for his breakfast to be served, as was the procedure with every meal. Eleanor watched from her own seat as her mother obediently bowed to his commands and did all that she could to ensure he was comfortable and content. She wondered if she would ever find that character trait in herself should she be in the unfortunate position of being in an unhappy marriage. She supposed you would do whatever was needed to survive, especially if there were children to consider. They ate their breakfast mostly in silence. The two ladies, with their eyes cast down to their plates, the man of the house staring ahead, with occasional glares directed at the women who felt his eyes boring into them. They knew better than to look up at him and challenge his stare, so they ate silently as they plotted in their own heads a way out, for Eleanor at least. She desperately wished she could take her mother with her, but she knew she would never break her marriage vows. Little over an hour later, the pair met in Eleanor's bedroom. Donald had gone out to see to business, he had said, and they had been relieved to hear he would not be around, at least for the morning. "Let's still be as quiet as can be, Eleanor," her mother warned gently. "We can't be sure that he won't come back unexpectedly, or that suspicion will not bring him to your doorway at any moment. We need to remain on high alert. We can't have anything stand in the way of our plans." Eleanor nodded her head in agreement with her mother's words as she silently guided her over to her bed where they sat together. She retrieved the publication from under her mattress at the top end of her bed, and as she smiled at her mother, she turned to the selected page. "Have you found one?" her mother whispered, her eyes full of sparkle and wonder. "Maybe. Let me show you and see what you think." Eleanor felt the nerves in her stomach, wondering what her mother might think of her choice. There was silence for a few moments while Elizabeth read the advertisement she had pointed out. It felt like an eternity for Eleanor, but could have been no more than 30 seconds in reality. "Oh, Eleanor, this man sounds just perfect, and far enough away to keep you safe," she said with enthusiasm, although Eleanor could see her mother's sadness also. "Mother, what about us? When will we see each other? How will we stay in touch?" she asked as tears filled her eyes. "I don't think that will be possible, my darling child," she replied, shadowing her sadness. "I have to do whatever I can to keep you safe, and if that means not seeing you, then it's a price we have to pay. It will be better for you than being in a loveless marriage with someone who may not be kind to you." Eleanor could see the pain behind her mother's eyes and knew there was no other way. One day, they would be free of the man and able to reunite. She didn't want to upset her mother any further, so she proposed they compose a letter together, which delighted her mother. Yes, let's get the ball rolling. One step closer to getting you away from this awful arranged marriage you would otherwise have to endure, Elizabeth proclaimed as Eleanor tiptoed across her room for a sheet of writing paper and a pen before joining her mother back on the bed. Mr. Booker, I do hope you welcome my letter. I read your advertisement for a wife in the Matrimonial Times and was compelled to write to you to introduce myself. I am Eleanor Kirby and I live in New York City. I, like you, am keen to start a family, and now that I am 19 years of age, I feel ready. The little I have heard about Arizona Territory and Thunder Valley leads me to believe that I should cherish it as a place to call home. Copper mining sounds like an interesting occupation, and I would love to hear more about it, if you would like to tell me. Do you enjoy your work? I wonder if the hours are long and arduous. I do hope this letter finds you well, and that you choose to enter into a correspondence in return. Regards, Eleanor Kirby. Together, they read over the letter they had composed before they agreed they had said all they could, in the best possible way for the moment. Every few minutes, while they spoke and wrote, they stopped and listened to the sounds of the house in case Donald had returned. They had been lucky this time. No sooner had they folded and sealed the envelope than the front door of the house was yanked open noisily. "Elizabeth," Donald bellowed through the house. "Where are you?" "I need coffee." Elizabeth quickly scurried quietly to her feet and across the wooden floor. Once at Eleanor's bedroom door, she turned and winked at her daughter, an excited smile on her face for the first time in a while as she closed the door silently behind her and headed to her husband. Eleanor realized she had been holding her breath since she heard the door open. She exhaled as quietly as she could, feeling slightly lightheaded as she hid the letter in her purse, which she took with her downstairs and into the kitchen, hoping to escape the house without much fuss. "Where do you think you're going?" Donald demanded to know, as he always did when she attempted to leave the house. She knew she needed to play this calmly, or she wouldn't be able to get her letter sent off. "I have errands to run in town," Eleanor said quietly, her eyes averted to the floor so he couldn't tell that she was lying. Although she wasn't really lying, she tried to justify to herself, as she would be going into town to mail the letter. That was classed as an errand, without a doubt. "What manner of errands?" he asked, unwilling to let it go quite so easily. "Oh, Donald, let the girl go without all the questions. She has personal lady problems at the moment, which require her to pick up a few things," Elizabeth said, thinking on her feet, knowing he would not push for further information when she mentioned personal lady issues. "Go then," he boomed louder than was necessary since she was in the same room. Donald glanced at Mary, the cook, who was busy preparing the dinner. She knew he had also relented because of her presence, and she was glad of it. "Don't be long. We need to discuss your next meeting with Grant." Eleanor felt her blood go cold as she heard mention of the man she would be marrying if Donald got his way. She looked at her mother, who beckoned her to leave by a tiny movement of her head. Putting her head down, she took hold of her purse more tightly as she opened the door and left the house. She felt a chill in the air as she stepped out onto the porch, even though it was a bright summer afternoon without any chill to be felt. As she walked to town, she allowed herself to daydream about what life could be like for her with a man such as Bradley Booker. She thought about the kind of mother she believed she would be. A mother just like her own, but with a kinder man by her side. The thought of not seeing her mother was almost too much to bear, but she rationalized that she should go ahead with her mother's plan as she was making the sacrifice for her happiness. It would be hard for them both, but it was the only way to escape this ludicrous arranged marriage. Maybe Eleanor was paranoid, sensing judgment when she handed the letter over for mailing. The postal worker would, of course, have no idea what was in the letter, but she nevertheless felt a pang of shame over her actions to secure herself a marriage prospect. She had always hoped she would meet her husband in the traditional way and fall in love just like her parents had. She paid the amount he requested as she felt a blush heat her cheeks blush. She kept her head down, hoping not to be noticed. She watched as the letter was placed into the sack behind the postal worker, which she knew would then be sorted and sent on. Chapter 5. 2 weeks had dragged by so slowly for Eleanor and Elizabeth. Donald had really enthused over the impending marriage, and progress seemed to be faster than the ladies had hoped, although Donald was still reluctant to let the deal go through until Mr. Turner had met his side of the bargain. They had all met over breakfast after church the previous Sunday, and Eleanor now noticed the slightly sinister demeanor displayed by Mr. Turner. He now seemed to be drinking her in with his eyes as he looked her up and down. It made her feel uncomfortable, so much so that she kept her eyes downcast and avoided conversation where possible. She had to remain impassive while not drawing attention or risk the wrath of her stepfather as a result. Since that day, Eleanor had been desperate to receive a reply to her letter, checking the mailbox every day even though she knew it was likely to take longer. She even wondered if she should keep her options open and respond to other advertisers in the Matrimonial Times. She would speak to her mother about it when they next had the chance. Donald had upped the supervision, and they rarely had a moment alone. Eleanor took her daily walk to check the mailbox. To her surprise, this time she found a small white envelope within. She gasped as she quickly grabbed the letter, checked to whom it was addressed, and searched for a way to hide it when she was sure it was indeed for her. She tucked it into her waistband so it was out of sight when she returned to the house, all the while berating herself for not having brought her purse. Walking through the kitchen, Eleanor tried to get a message to her mother with her eyes while aiming not to be noticed by Donald, who was at the table and appeared not to be about to move or leave any time soon. Her attempts were unsuccessful, so she made her way to the foot of the stairs as slowly as she could in the hope her mother would look at her. Finally, she did. Eleanor patted the envelope at her waistline and gave a small nod of her head, feeling safer now that she was standing behind her stepfather. Elizabeth's eyes widened, and her expression filled briefly with excitement as she acknowledged what her daughter was trying to tell her. "What are you looking so giddy about?" Donald asked Elizabeth as Eleanor silently hurried up the old wooden staircase. She heard her mother divert his attention with more coffee as she closed her bedroom door. Eleanor wondered if she should wait until her mother came up to her room before she opened the letter, which must surely be from Mr. Bradley Brooker. With no idea when that might be, she decided she simply could not wait, so she gently and quietly opened the seal of the envelope. Once she had the letter in her hands, she listened for sounds to make sure she was not about to be interrupted by her stepfather. Thankfully, he seemed incapable of being quiet, so she was confident she would hear him if he did make his way up the stairs. "Miss Kirby, thank you for your letter. I surely did welcome it and enjoyed reading it. I am glad you happened across my advertisement in the Matrimonial Times. It is not something I would ordinarily find myself doing, but with the work I do, it is unlikely I am going to meet a lady like yourself in the traditional manner. There is not much to know about Arizona Territory and Thunder Valley. I am sure life in New York City is much more exciting. I do like my work, most of the time. It can be a little dangerous at times, but I'm confident that I'm good at what I do, so I mostly feel safe and content about my responsibility over the other men. You are right about the hours. They are unpredictable and can indeed be long and difficult. But I am grateful for the work, and I do like to work hard and earn my keep." Sent. You indicate in your letter that you might not have a family home at the moment. Do you feel like you could tell me more about your home life? Do you live with your parents? What does your father do? What do you enjoy doing? I hope you don't mind me asking questions. I would just really like to get to know you better. I look forward to hearing from you, hopefully soon. Regards, Bradley. Please use my Christian name. Eleanor held the letter to her heart as she felt it racing within her chest. A big smile spread across her face. This man seemed to be so nice and interested in her, which she hadn't yet experienced. Mr. Turner had asked nothing about her the few times they had met, and of course, her stepfather had no interest in what she had to say about anything. Something caught her attention in the envelope that she had discarded on the white bedspread. She looked inside the envelope and retrieved a glossy rectangle, slightly thicker than the paper on which he had written. When she turned it over, she lost her breath as she realized it was a photograph of a very handsome Bradley Brooker. She looked at his dark hair and kind brown eyes, touching the small photograph in wonder and awe. He was clearly a man who enjoyed the outdoors, as was evident by his rugged good looks and working hands. Eleanor heard a sound outside her bedroom. She held her breath, unsure if she would have the time to tuck the letter and photograph away, and if she would be quiet enough not to draw attention to her movements. After a quiet rap on the door, she let her breath out, knowing that it must be her mother. Once again, they sat on the bed together. "He has fallen asleep in his chair on the porch, so I thought I would take the opportunity," her mother shared. Clearly anxious about being found out, her eyes went to the contents of Eleanor's hands and a questioning smile lit her face. "Oh, Mother, look at this," Eleanor declared as she passed her mother the photograph of the handsome man. Elizabeth gasped and then looked at her daughter, and they giggled as quietly as they could. "Here, read the letter." She passed it to her mother and gave her a moment to read it in silence. She could see her mother's eyes filling with tears. "Oh, Eleanor, this young man seems just perfect for my daughter. I am so relieved. We have to work fast, though. We need him to ask you to go out there to him as soon as possible. I can't stay for long, but you prepare a response, and if you would like me to, I can have a look over it before you send it. Don't come across as desperate, but do let him know discreetly that you are available immediately," she advised her daughter, who let out a small laugh. "How am I meant to do that?" she asked as her mother rose from the bed and crossed to the door. "You'll find a way. I know you will. You cannot marry that Mr. Turner. You have to find a way," she whispered as she pulled the door closed behind her. Eleanor knew her mother was right and that she needed to reply immediately and get her letter sent so Mr. Booker would receive it without delay. She collected her paper and pencil, just as she had a little over 2 weeks before, only this time she sat down alone to write. "Dear Bradley, it feels unusual addressing you by your Christian name when we haven't even met, but I like it, so thank you. You are also welcome to address me by my Christian name. I was so pleased to receive your letter this morning. I very much enjoyed reading it, and I would like to thank you. I, too, would never normally refer to a publication such as the Matrimonial Times. My mother thought it a good idea, and I am now glad she did. I don't know about New York City being more exciting, as there doesn't seem to be an awful lot of excitement around these parts. You can't. I guess we create our own excitement. And since reading your letter, I have felt excited about our future conversations. It sounds to me as though you are very good at your job and that you look after everyone else to keep them safe too. I admire that. It can't be easy, but I can tell you thrive. I live with my beloved mother, but also my stepfather, who unfortunately has little tolerance for much. So, although I do live in a family home, there is little laughter and little love, which I crave more and more as I get older. My mother does her best, but her hands are tied. She is keen for me to swiftly find a new life, hence the Matrimonial Times. My father died when I was a young child. He was a good man and worked as a banker, an honorable and honest one, which apparently is becoming rare these days. I love to go for walks and to read. My father taught me before he passed, and so I am often tucked away in my room or in a local park when the weather is pleasant, reading one of the few books I own. Of course, I don't mind you asking questions. I am enjoying getting to know you. You sound like a very kind and courteous man, if you don't mind me saying so. I wonder if you would like to tell me more about yourself. Do your parents live near to you? Do you have any other family members? What are your interests? Thank you for the photograph. It is very nice to put a face to the name. I will have my photograph taken and sent by the next letter, as I don't want to delay this one getting to you. I will await your response with bated breath. Kindest regards, Eleanor. Later that day, Eleanor had some precious alone time with her mother after Donald went off to the tavern to meet with Mr. Turner to discuss their upcoming deal further. He would no doubt be very late returning, which was fine by them as it gave them time to chat. "That is just perfect, Eleanor. I wouldn't change a single thing," Elizabeth exclaimed as she read the letter her daughter had prepared to send to Bradley Booker. "Are you sure? Do you not think I sound too expectant and willing?" Eleanor asked, worried she would come across as desperate. "Not at all. I think you have managed to present just the right balance, so he will be in no doubt that you are interested. Remember, we need things to move fast to avoid this awful marriage arrangement. Who knows where they will be up to with it all after this evening's meeting." The two ladies had an enjoyable evening chatting about where the future could take Eleanor and what kind of life they supposed she could have with Mr. Booker. They talked sadly about how they would miss each other, but Elizabeth was insistent that this was the only way to save her daughter from a marriage that could be as bad as hers, although those words remained unsaid. Chapter 6. Dear Eleanor, addressing you by your lovely name is an honor. It seems we have a mutual interest, as I too enjoy reading. At the moment, my favorite time is spent reading and rereading your letters. Your mother sounds very wise for wanting a better life for you than she seems to currently be experiencing. It must be difficult to live with someone with little tolerance, and especially difficult if he is unable to express love. I am sure he does love you both. How could he not? You seem to have figured me out quickly. I am indeed the type of man who likes to look after others. My mother always used to marvel at it, although my father would often mock me, in a kind way, of course. My parents passed away a few years ago, sadly. Both contracted cholera and died within a few days of each other. I miss them every day. They were both very dear to me. I look forward to receiving your photograph with your next letter as well as your response. Kindest regards, Bradley. Chapter 7. Eleanor had included a photograph of herself in her last letter and was anxiously awaiting his response. What if he didn't approve of her appearance? She knew she was not lacking in looks. In fact, some had called her pretty. However, what if she wasn't to his taste? Eleanor knew time was running out, although Donald was thankfully proving particularly stubborn over the business deal. He and Mr. Turner were at loggerheads over some of the fine points. He had told Eleanor and Elizabeth, having spent the evening together at the tavern. "Try not to worry. I am sure he loved the photograph of you. How could he not? You are so beautiful," her mother said, which didn't placate Eleanor at all. Of course, her mother would say such a thing. "I should have used your makeup like I have to when I meet with Mr. Turner. It makes me look older, I think," Eleanor reflected. "No," her mother said abruptly, making Eleanor jump. They were taking a walk into town together and so had the freedom to talk, but it was not like her mother to become agitated and loud. "Sorry, dear, it's just that Mr. Booker needs to love you for what you are. We don't need to sell you to him. I am sure he will be perfectly happy with what he sees." She gave a final nod of her head to clarify her firmness on the situation. They continued their walk in amicable silence, both deep in their own thoughts. Eleanor hoped Mr. Booker did like what he saw in the photograph, but she couldn't be certain, and she couldn't help but feel self-conscious and worried about it. She understood what her mother was saying, and she knew she was saying it as much about her own marriage as the one Eleanor hoped to enter into, but she couldn't help being nervous. She didn't want to have to marry Mr. Turner, and the only way she could see to get herself out of this was through her mother's plan to become a mail-order bride. She was out of time to start reading the advertisements again and to begin the exercise from scratch. She would be married against her wishes before any advertiser could even so much as reply to her. When they arrived in town, they went their separate ways to complete their tasks quicker. Eleanor was under instruction to collect the groceries, and so she promptly headed to the store. While shopping, she wondered about the cook at Bradley's home. She hoped she would be just as good as Mary, who made them delicious meals. This was despite occasionally running low on the groceries she preferred, because Donald had refused to provide funds for the week after a late night in the tavern. Well, I heard he was at least 30 years older than he proclaimed in his advertisement. The cashier was explaining to the lady in front of Eleanor as she went to pay for her groceries, all but one of the items on her list collected. Never. I heard he was a short and round man with no money to his name, the lady shopper replied, her voice loud for all to hear. The cashier had the decency to indicate to the customer that they had company, and the two lowered their voices considerably. That poor girl. Although she was naive to think she could find a man to marry through a newspaper, the cashier commented in a hushed voice as she finished calculating the goods to be paid for. The matrimonial times. Whatever next, laughed the lady, looking to the cashier and then to Eleanor, who knew her cheeks must be blistering with embarrassment. Eleanor looked away, a tight smile on her lips in an attempt to look all right with the conversation. She wondered about the subject of their discussion. It was obviously someone from town, and they all knew each other around these parts. She didn't much move in the gossiping circles, which meant she often missed the goings-on and current happenings. Prosody and Crower. She suddenly felt the need to know and felt compelled to ask the identity of the woman who had been duped by the matrimonial times. Were it not for the shame of trying for a match as a mail-order bride, she probably would not have kept her mouth shut and waited patiently for her turn to be served. Well, she's made her own bed, if you ask me. Why anyone would believe what they read in these things is beyond me. What happened to the old-fashioned way of meeting a man at church or through your parents? The lady customer handed over her money, and Eleanor willed them to hurry so she could purchase her groceries and get out of there. Thankfully, it appeared their conversation was complete. With a shrug of the cashier's delicate shoulders, the customer was on her way. Eleanor paid for her groceries in silence, thanked the cashier, and left as promptly as she could. Once outside, she walked swiftly to the nearest bench, where she sat to take a deep breath, aware that she had stifled her breathing in the presence of the ladies in the shop. They had ignited fear in the pit of her stomach. She had convinced herself that Mr. Brooker was an honest man who had told her nothing but the truth. But how could she truly know until she got out there and saw for herself? A few moments later, her mother joined her on the wooden bench. "Whatever's the matter, Eleanor? Are you all right?" she asked, putting the back of her hand on her daughter's head to check for a fever. "You look like you have had a fright." Eleanor began to sob and told her mother what had just happened in the store. Elizabeth soothed her daughter, stroking her arm as she listened to her experience of the local gossip. She had a mind to storm in there and remind those women that they should keep their thoughts to themselves, but she knew that would do her daughter no good at a time when she needed her. "Eleanor, you shouldn't listen to gossip. Keep in mind that I know ladies who have found happiness through the matrimonial times and lives that have worked out like a dream. Of course, there is always a risk, but remember that Mr. Brooker has provided you with proof in the form of a photograph that he is a decent young man, didn't he?" she asked gently. Eleanor brightened a little at this reminder. "Oh yes, that's true. They just got me worried, that's all. I'm putting all my hopes into a relationship with a man I have never met." She wiped her face, removing the tear stains from her pale skin. "My darling, you barely know what you are getting from a man you have already met." Her mother replied gently with pain in her eyes as she referred to her own husband. Eleanor nodded in understanding and stood, ready to take on the rest of their chores and get back to the relative safety of home. Chapter 8. 7 days. "We have just 7 days until our deal is done," Eleanor's stepfather announced on his return from the tavern early that evening. Elizabeth and Eleanor had been quietly chatting in the kitchen, worrying that they had not yet received a reply from Mr. Brooker since sending the photograph. They had thought they had a few hours to spend together comfortably until the clearly drunken man stumbled through the door with his statement. The pair looked at each other in horror, Eleanor's eyes filling with tears at this news. "Didn't you hear me? 7 days until the big day. And the very next day, you will marry Mr. Grant Turner," he declared as though she should be eternally grateful to him for this. Why so soon? Elizabeth asked, standing from her chair as Donald approached the table. It's not soon enough for me. He laughed as he slumped into his usual chair at the table in the kitchen, which buckled under his increasing weight. He didn't seem to notice at all. Eleanor watched, aghast, as her mother automatically moved to the stove to heat water to make coffee for her husband. She could see her mother's hands shaking as she carried out the task that she carried out many times a day. Eleanor's mind began to blur, her thoughts all mixed up, making her dizzy. She took a breath and thought about the man's announcement. Before Donald had walked through the door, she had been thinking how unbearable it would be to move away and not see her mother. But now she realized the thought of being married to Mr. Turner was a worse situation to consider. And even if she did stay close to her mother and married to Mr. Turner, there was no guarantee he would allow her to see her mother as often as she would want to, she realized. Eleanor was just going up to bed, weren't you, dear? Her mother asked, pulling her from her thoughts, leaving her momentarily confused as she had not intended anything of the sort. It's early, Donald bellowed. We have matters to talk about. What's the matter with you? He demanded as he looked at Eleanor and saw how pale she had become. Oh, just lady problems, Elizabeth stated as Donald scoffed in disdain. Nothing we can't sort out. This was always the safe way to go, as she knew her husband would never delve into this subject. Elizabeth helped her daughter to her feet and in the direction of the staircase. There will be none of this when you're married, my girl, his gruff voice instructed from behind them. No time for any of this. You will just have to grin and bear it and carry on, he declared, sending chills down Eleanor's spine. Elizabeth walked Eleanor to her room but knew she wouldn't have much time to talk to her or reassure her. She promptly shut the door behind them, and they sat on the bed together as they had so many times before. Eleanor began to cry, silent tears rolling down her cheeks and dropping to her dress. Try not to panic, Elizabeth encouraged. We will think of something. I will not let this marriage go ahead. She held her daughter's hands in her own and wished she could take this pain from her. Liz, her husband bellowed from the kitchen, agitated by the liquor. I have to go. Try to get some sleep. Tomorrow will be a brighter day. Donald will be busy preparing for the deal to go through, I am sure, so we will have the chance to talk at length, she promised hopefully, as she kissed her daughter's head and quickly left the room to tend to her husband. Eleanor felt so alone as she sat on her bed, desperate to erase the last 30 minutes. How could she have let it come to this? Maybe she should have sent Mr. Brooker another letter when she got no reply. But maybe she would then have seemed desperate, and the man would surely have been put off. She quickly undressed and made short time of her bedtime routine and ablutions before she climbed into her bed and lay her head heavily on her pillows. She felt the tears hitting her pillow at the sides of her face before she even knew they were falling. Eleanor wished she had never sent the photograph, for surely that was what had put him off and caused him not to reply. But then, if he had not seen a picture of her before they met, surely that would be duplicitous on her part. Sleep was intermittent as Eleanor's brain went into overdrive and thought of every scenario that she could possibly have handled differently. Her dreams were fitful as images of Mr. Turner played over and over in her mind, and she dreamt of being trapped in a marriage just like her mother. She often awoke with a start, unable to get back to sleep. Chapter 9. Eleanor woke with a start. Her sleep-deprived head pounded before she even lifted it from the pillow, and her stomach filled with dread as she recalled her stepfather's announcement the previous evening. Tears stung her eyes. She had nothing to get up for, and so she decided to remain in bed. She listened silently as Donald emerged from his bedroom and noisily made his way down the stairs to the kitchen, where she knew their cook, Mary, would have breakfast prepared and ready for his arrival. He coughed and spluttered as he did every morning after he had been out drinking and smoking the night before. As he passed her bedroom, she could hear him grumbling to himself as he always seemed to. She wondered if he had even been happy in his life, if he had ever known happiness, ever smiled, ever laughed. She couldn't recall it at that moment, although she realized he must have seemed happy, at least at the beginning, to have won her mother's heart. Mr. Turner appeared to be a kinder man than her stepfather, at least so far as she knew about him at that stage. Maybe her life would not be as bad as she and her mother had predicted with him. Perhaps it was time to admit defeat and accept her fate. There was a quiet knock on her door, and before she even had a chance to speak or get out of bed to answer it, her mother rushed in and knelt on the floor by her head. "We will find a way out. We will. I promise you, my darling," she whispered, tears pushing at her eyelids as they tried to escape. Elizabeth wiped them quickly, fearful of her husband noticing. They both knew they needed to keep up the facade that all was well, and they were in agreement with the marriage. The last thing Eleanor wanted was for Donald to become angry and aggressive, and taking it out on her mother again because of this situation. Eleanor simply nodded silently, willing her mother to be right, but feeling too disconsolate to answer. Her mother squeezed her hand and stood to leave. "Stay in bed. I will say, you're not feeling well," she suggested, and Eleanor nodded her agreement, her sad eyes searching her mother's for answers and help. She didn't feel as though she had the energy to even get out of bed anyway, so she was glad her mother had presented a solution. She watched as her mother left her room and heard her go down the stairs to her husband, where they would eat breakfast together as though it was not the end of the world, as it felt to Eleanor. She closed her eyes. She didn't want to see this world. Her room, the house. She wanted to block it all out. She allowed herself to sleep, tired as she was after enduring a restless night. "Eleanor! Eleanor!" her mother called as she heard her bedroom door fly open and her mother enter. "Look," her mother declared, holding something in her hand. Eleanor struggled to open her eyes and focus, coming out of a deep sleep. Her heart beat fast at being awoken so abruptly, and she worried her stepfather would hear. As if reading her thoughts, her mother reassured her that he had gone out for the day and would not be back until dinner. He was busy preparing for his business deal. No doubt. She looked to the window with the drapes still pulled, but she could see a bright and sunny day beyond. She had no idea how long she had slept or how late it was. Elizabeth instructed her to sit up quickly, and then she sat on the bed with her daughter, holding out an envelope. Eleanor realized what this could be and could not believe her bleary eyes. She looked from her mother to the envelope more than once, asking her mother with her eyes if it could possibly be the much-anticipated letter from Mr. Brooker. "It is a letter from Mr. Brooker, Eleanor. It has finally arrived," her mother stated excitedly. Eleanor gasped and took it gingerly from her mother's hands. She glanced at her mother again, who nodded encouragingly that she should open it. Tears stung her eyes as she recognized his writing. He had finally replied. Maybe he hadn't taken a disliking to her after seeing her photograph after all. Or maybe this letter was to let her down gently, she wondered. She gently and carefully unsealed the envelope, taking her time as though it was the most precious thing in the world, when in reality she was anxious to see what lay within. She slowly opened the sheet of paper and read, devouring each word in silence, knowing her mother was staring at her, looking for any hint as to what it might divulge. "Dearest Eleanor, firstly, please let me apologize for my very tardy reply. There have been some problems at the mine recently, and we lost some very good men, sadly. But that is not the only reason I have not replied to you until now. In truth, the delay is my need to think the situation over." She took a deep breath before she continued, glancing up at her mother, who looked back at her expectantly. "I was taken aback by your photograph. You look to be a beautiful lady, both inside and out, and I have wondered if I deserve such a lady, and if I could look after you in the way that you deserve. I don't know if I can give you all you need, but I do know that I would die trying." Eleanor held her breath, another glance at her mother, and she allowed herself a small smile. He liked her photograph after all. "And so I have decided to let you choose whether you think I would be a man you can depend upon for the rest of your life. It is not fair of me to keep you waiting while I consider my self-worth, so I decided to write and put my heart on the line. Eleanor Kirby, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" I realize this might seem completely out of the blue for you, but I have been falling for you with each letter, and I hope the feeling has been mutual. There are often horror stories about mail order brides and advertising in the matrimonial times and the like, but I feel as if our situation is different. I feel like we know each other, really know each other, before we have even met. If you would do me the honor of becoming my wife, I would love nothing more than for you to travel to me as soon as possible. I have looked into it and found 2 trains a week, on a Monday and a Friday, leaving New York City mid-afternoon. I will look forward to either a letter by reply or meeting you soon. I am going to be waiting on the platform in Arizona Territory each time a train is due in until I hear from you, just in case. I don't want you to arrive without some sort of welcoming reception. Yours, Bradley. Eleanor allowed a huge, beaming smile to cross her face as she looked up at her mother and passed her the letter to read. She watched her read and could tell which part she was reading with each change in facial expression. Oh, Eleanor, this could not have happened at a better time. I am so pleased for you. Our plan has worked, and now you get to live your life with a truly kind and wonderful man. Surely you must believe he is the man he claims to be now? She asked, referring to the gossiping ladies in the store who had made her doubt her decision. Oh, Mother, of course. He sounds like a dream, she replied as she pulled back the covers and hopped out of bed. She could no longer remain still and was suddenly brimming with energy. When will I go? She asked her mother, who stood to join her. Well, Monday is tomorrow, so we probably don't have enough time to put the plans in place and get you on the train in time. But Friday would be perfect, since that will be the day on which your stepfather closes the deal with Mr. Turner. Percent. They will be out all day, and I know they will be at the tavern that evening, as it is Mr. Turner's last night of freedom. It will be Saturday morning before your absence is even detected. How fitting that he should discover you are not here to conclude his business deal on the very intended day of your marriage, her mother suggested bitterly and triumphantly. All right, that sounds like a plan. I can't believe this is actually happening. She suddenly paused. Oh, Mother, what about the train ticket? I have no money. In her sadness, she had hoped that Bradley might have sent the funds for the ticket for her to travel to him, but she checked the envelope and found it empty. Don't you worry at all, my love. I have been hiding a little each week, and we have more than enough to cover the fare as well as refreshments during your journey. Elizabeth showed the smile on her pretty face, knowing finally that her daughter was not going to be trapped in a loveless marriage. Oh, thank you so much, Mother. I can't believe you have done that for me. That was such a risk, Eleanor responded, referring to what could have happened if Donald had discovered the deceit. It was nothing. We just had a little less for groceries, and he was none the wiser because Mary is so good at cooking us up a feast, her mother replied. I wonder about your cook in Arizona. This allowed Eleanor to imagine her new life. Chapter 10. Now remember, you must not write to me for at least the first 3 months. I don't want him to get any idea of where you might have gone. We don't know how soon you will marry Mr. Brooker, and I don't want anything to stand in your way. Least of all Donald, her mother reminded her as they waited on the platform for the imminent arrival of the train. Oh, Mother, I am going to miss you so much, Eleanor stated, tears filling her eyes beneath her bonnet. I know, my love, but we have to do this. You have to do this. You deserve a better life than the one you would be marrying into tomorrow. Her mother reminded her of what she faced, and Eleanor knew she meant a better life than the one she endured with Donald. Now, take what's left after paying for the ticket, and make sure you eat and drink well on the way. You need to look your best when you arrive, and your husband-to-be meets you at your destination. She handed over every last penny she had. Thank you. I love you, Mother, Eleanor said, not for the first time that day. And I have left a letter for you on my dresser, so that is where you will find it when you go in tomorrow morning to check on me when I fail to make an appearance. Elizabeth nodded her head, and Eleanor was able to detect the sadness in her eyes that her only daughter was leaving her. but they knew it was for the best, and they both tried to be strong for each other. Here it is. You had better get yourself on board. Find your carriage and get yourself settled. You have a long journey ahead of you, Elizabeth guided as the train pulled into the platform and the pair embraced for the last time. Goodbye, Mama, and thank you, Eleanor said quietly into her mother's ear before she turned and carried her small bag to the train, where she accepted a gentleman's hand to board. She wandered down the corridor, glancing at her mother through the windows until she found her carriage. Once inside, she could no longer see her mother on the opposite side of the train, so she busied herself getting settled. When the train pulled out to continue its journey, Eleanor allowed her tears to flow. She was alone in her carriage, so she could be comfortable to be herself for the time being. She cried for her mother, whom she was going to miss dreadfully, and for the life her mother would now have to live, and the potential consequences should Donald discover their connivance. The first day of the journey was long, even though Eleanor had boarded in the afternoon. Time seemed to have slowed, or maybe even stopped altogether. When darkness finally fell, she was relieved, as it meant she could finally go to sleep. Time would surely pass faster then, although she didn't feel confident that she would be able to sleep with the movement of the train. She had a fitful sleep, often finding herself awake and crying for her mother. She knew she was going to miss her so much. They had never spent a night apart since the day she was born, and she felt as though she was out on a limb without her mother by her side. She worried so much for her mother. What if Donald didn't believe that she had no knowledge of Eleanor's plotting? She knew Donald would be furious about her going missing and not marrying his business colleague, but it would be so much worse for her mother if he thought she had anything to do with her leaving. Chapter 11. When the train reached Arizona territory in the late morning, Eleanor glanced out the window, eager to get her first look at Bradley Brooker. She remembered exactly what he looked like from his photograph and prayed she would see a man fitting her expectation waiting on the platform. During the second day of her journey, they had made a stop for more passengers to board. Eleanor had a companion in her carriage as a result, which she was a little unhappy about at first, although as gracious and welcoming as always. Her travel companion introduced herself as Agatha. She was considerably older than her, maybe even in her 60s, Eleanor thought. They became acquainted and chatted amicably for the remainder of the journey. The company helped to pass the time better, leaving Eleanor feeling that her destination had arrived suddenly and that she wasn't yet ready. Of course, throughout the journey, Eleanor had been plagued with worries about her mother. She cried often over the uncertainty of what might have happened once Donald discovered she was missing on the day that would have seen her wed to conclude his business deal. She looked to her right and waved to Agatha, bidding her a final farewell. She was continuing on the train journey, arriving at her destination a few days later. She looked out the window to her left and caught her breath when she spotted him. Bradley Brooker was standing on the platform, his chiseled face serious as he searched the train for her. He looked smarter than he had in his photograph. She wondered if he had donned his Sunday best in anticipation of her arrival. She smiled at the very moment he spotted her, and he returned her smile warmly. When the train fully stopped, her disembarking was assisted by a porter. No sooner had her feet touched the floor than Bradley Brooker was standing in front of her, kindly offering to carry her bag. She accepted his offer gratefully as her cheeks became rosier with admiration of his handsome, rugged looks. "Thank you, sir," she said as he took her bag. "Please, call me Bradley. It is so good to meet you. I am so glad you came," he gushed, his cheeks flushed pink. "I'm sorry I didn't have a chance to tell you that I was coming. I knew a letter wouldn't get to you in time, and as you said you would be here anyway, I thought I would just take my chances." "My carriage? Our carriage is just out here," he said, correcting himself quickly. Eleanor was surprised at the diminutive size of the carriage, drawn by a single horse. She hopped on happily, accepting his helping hand into her seat beside him as the driver. In New York, Eleanor was accustomed to carriages driven by professional drivers, and pulled by at least 2 horses. This was a nice change, and she enjoyed sitting up front beside her husband-to-be. Bradley pointed out the sights along the way, helping her to get acquainted with the surroundings. The ride was long, but the time passed pleasantly, and they chatted with ease. As they drove, it occurred to Eleanor that in their exchange of letters, they had never discussed Bradley's financial position. She knew that he was a hard worker, and that was all that mattered to Eleanor. There was honor and strength in a man who worked hard and honestly to keep his family, just as her father had. Bradley seemed charming and sweet throughout the journey, being careful not to travel too fast and to show her everything he thought would be of interest to her. He spoke in a gentle and calming voice, so different from her stepfather. "Are we going to your home?" Eleanor asked after a while of seeing the sights. "Our home," he reminded her, with a small smile on his lips. "Not yet. I live alone, you see, so it wouldn't be proper for me to take you home until we are married." He prosody rate. "I hope you don't mind, but I have provisionally arranged for the wedding to take place this afternoon." He cautiously spoke out, clearly worried about her response. "That sounds just perfect to me," Eleanor replied. If her stepfather was coming after her and he somehow knew where she was, he would be powerless to do anything if she was already married. It therefore did seem perfect, if not a little hasty. "You will, of course, have your own bedroom. I would never take advantage, and I want you to be comfortable and happy in our home," he added kindly. He had thought of everything, and she really appreciated his gentlemanly manner. Eleanor was pleased to have her few belongings with her, including the gown she would wear for her wedding ceremony. "Will I have time to freshen up and change my clothes before the wedding?" she asked, and he looked across at her and smiled. "You have all the time in the world, dear Eleanor. I would never rush you. There is a room at the chapel where you will be able to freshen up." Eleanor realized this was why he was dressed better than he had been for the photograph. She thought it was sweet of him to be so well prepared and to have thought about how best to make it special for her. The chapel was small and the ceremony was short. They returned to the carriage as husband and wife in the eyes of the Lord and made their way home. Eleanor enjoyed the way her husband looked at her. He was clearly smitten, and she felt exactly the same. She thought again back to the ladies in the grocery store who had made the assumption that every mail-order bride would be duped. How wrong could they be, she thought happily. "Here we are," Bradley said as he turned off the road and onto a dirt track, seemingly in the middle of nowhere. He turned and smiled at her proudly as they approached a small building, not much more than a cabin in reality. Eleanor could see how proud he was, and she didn't want to hurt his feelings, so she made all the right admiring noises. Their home was so much smaller than she could have anticipated, however. She wondered if it might appear bigger on the inside. Bradley helped her from the carriage, his smile sending shivers down her spine in a way she had never experienced before. He held her hand as he escorted her up the few wooden steps onto the tiny porch and opened the door into a small kitchen. His pride was infectious, and she tried to see the interior through his eyes as Bradley showed her around his humble home. 2 very small bedrooms, a living room, and a small kitchen with a toilet around the back of the house. Outside of the house, the rooms were furnished minimally, and it was clear that he had tried to make it look as appealing as he could for Eleanor, which she appreciated. Eleanor suddenly realized how privileged she had always been. She wasn't aware that people could live this way. She knew he worked hard for his money and had assumed his living conditions to be better than they were. She could tell from his pride that he didn't realize his norm consisted of less than she had ever experienced, and she worked hard not to show it. She didn't want him to feel bad or to minimize his pride. She wondered if this was what the women in the grocery store would call being duped. She didn't think so, though. She and Bradley had never discussed finances in their letters, so he had never lied, and she had never laid out any expectations. They had simply experienced different lives. "I took the liberty of buying groceries for the week, as I always do. I hope that's in order. I know you might have had something in mind for this evening's meal," so I'm sorry if I haven't made allowance for anything you might have intended," he said tentatively as he led her to the storage shelf that was the pantry. Eleanor suddenly realized in horror that he didn't have a cook and felt her face pale. She was so ill-prepared with very little experience of cooking as it had always been done for them, and now she was expected to cook their first evening meal together as man and wife. "All right, I will set to then, I think," she replied, trying to appear confident. She panicked when she saw Bradley retreat to make himself comfortable at the far end of the table, facing her. The last thing she needed was for him to watch her find her feet around the kitchen, preparing the first meal she had ever been even remotely involved with preparing. She had no idea what she was doing. "Are you sure you are all right, Eleanor? You look pale all of a sudden," he exclaimed now that he was facing her and could see her clearly. She panicked about whether to come clean and admit that she had never cooked, being that she had always had meals prepared by a cook. What kind of a wife would that make her in his eyes, she wondered. "To be honest, Bradley, I have not much experience with cooking," she admitted as she looked around the small kitchen, feeling overwhelmed and out of her depth. "Oh, of course," he suddenly said as he jumped to his feet. "You lived with your mother. I'm sure she did all the cooking for you and your stepfather. I'm so sorry if I made you feel inadequate." He approached her and they stood side by side before the stove. She could almost feel his fingertips next to hers. "Not at all. Please don't apologize. It was a perfectly reasonable assumption to make, and I should be able to cook for my husband," she replied sadly, wishing she had taken the time to learn from Mary. "How about we do this together? We can help each other. I am not a chef, but I know my way around because I have been looking after myself for so long. Together, I bet we can cook up a treat fit for our wedding night." His beaming smile melted her heart yet again. Maybe it didn't matter that they were not as wealthy as she had assumed they would be. Over the next hour or so they cooked together, peeling vegetables and preparing a broth that tasted delicious. Eleanor enjoyed the time together, and they chatted with ease over dinner at the table. "I will have to go back into work tomorrow. I only managed to get the one day off work. I'm sorry," Bradley admitted. Eleanor felt slightly panicky in her stomach at the thought of being alone all day, but hid that from him so he would not worry about her during the day. "That's all right. I can have a good look around and make myself at home," she replied, to which he nodded enthusiastically as he told her she could do whatever she wanted in the house, move anything around, take anything out. He just asked her to be careful moving heavy things and suggested she wait until he was home to help. She smiled at his thoughtfulness and kindness. That evening, Eleanor made herself as comfortable as she could in her small room. She changed for bed and lay her head on the thin pillow. She felt so many emotions. She was in awe of her husband. She was worried about her mother. She couldn't understand how people could live in such a small place with no help. She felt out of her depths and ill-equipped to manage a home on her own, even if the home was this small. She cried herself to sleep, alone, on her first night as a married woman. Chapter 12. Eleanor awoke to movement in the room next to hers. Bradley had explained that he would be up and out early in the morning for his normal early start at the mine. She listened as he got himself ready and heard as he closed the door behind him when he left the kitchen. She climbed out of bed and opened her drapes. She saw more houses just like theirs in the distance, with men filtering out of each of them, which had her wonder whether these were the homes for the mining community. She had no idea where the mine was situated. Bradley had pointed it out the previous day, but she had lost her bearings. She would explore when she felt confident enough, she thought. With a cup of coffee in hand, Eleanor sat on the old rocking chair on the porch. It looked a little worse for wear, but actually felt perfectly sturdy when she sat on it. Sipping her coffee, she wanted nothing more than to write to her mother and tell her about the terrible conditions in which she had found herself. But then she remembered Bradley's smile, and her stomach flipped. She knew how ungrateful and conceited it would sound for her to admit feeling as if she was living in impoverished conditions. She was just not used to this life. Not that the conditions were bad. She realized she was a married woman now and that this was her life. She would have to get used to it and make the most of her new reality. At least she had Bradley by her side, and she knew already that he would support her and help her to settle in and make the home her own. Eleanor also knew she could not write to her mother, for she had been forbidden to do so for at least 3 months. She didn't want to get her into any trouble if she could help it, so she resisted the urge to write, telling her mother about things in her own head. One day, they would be reunited, and she would be able to tell her everything. Drinking the last of the coffee in her mug, she took in the beautiful green surroundings of the house and felt a renewed energy. She decided to make the most of her situation and give the cabin a good clean from top to bottom. Maybe the house just needed a woman's touch, as Bradley had implied when he said she could do whatever she wanted with their place. Eleanor spent the day scrubbing and dusting and brushing until everything gleamed as much as possible. Each room looked infinitely better when she was done. She left all the furniture where it already was, as she thought Bradley had positioned them to their best advantage. She only stopped briefly for lunch, quickly making herself a bowl of soup and storing the rest for the days to come. By the time Bradley opened the door in the late afternoon, she was tired out from all the hard work. He must have been tired too, but if he was, he hid it well and encouraged her to show him all she had achieved. He made all the right noises at every chance and seemed delighted with her day's work. She was proud and had a renewed sense of wonder about the small cabin. It now felt more like hers, and she felt somewhat defensive over it. She realized as she showed him what she had done, anxious that he might not like it. She made them both coffee, and they enjoyed it out on the porch together, talking about their time apart over the day. She found it so easy to talk to him, which was a relief since she had only really known her stepfather as a manly figure for so long, and she had never been able to talk to him. She felt like an adult with Bradley, like a real woman rather than a girl. "You have made this house feel like a home again. Thank you so much, Eleanor," Bradley gushed. "Again?" Eleanor questioned. "Yes, like when Mother and Father were here," he explained. "You lived here with your parents?" she asked, trying to hide the shock that so many people could live under such a small roof. "Yes, Ma kept it so pristine, and it was always so welcoming. I'm afraid I didn't really have that skill. I tried after they passed, but it never seemed quite the same. Now, well, you have brought life back into it. Thank you," he said, his sober face breaking into a smile as he looked up at her. "It's my pleasure. You have a lovely home." She meant it. "We have a lovely home," he corrected, and she smiled joyfully in response. "Right, I should start dinner," Eleanor exclaimed as she realized the time. She jumped up from the rocking chair and stepped past him. "May I help you? I enjoyed working with you last night," he offered as he stood to follow her indoors. She appreciated his offer and was thankful, having no real plans for a meal, being that she had been so busy cleaning all day. "I enjoyed it too, so I would love that, please, if you're not too tired." He shook his head and followed her into the kitchen. They worked together and were soon at the table, eating boiled ham and fresh vegetables. Bradley shared his hopes and ambitions for his work. He wanted to one day be the mine owner, not just one of the miners. He was confident he would be able to do this well because he genuinely cared about every single one of the men that went into that mine every day. Eleanor knew he would excel at it, but wondered why people couldn't be happy as they were. Her stepfather had always wanted more, and she hoped Bradley wasn't the same, although her husband seemed very different, and with more ethical reasons. Chapter 13. Eleanor was at rather a loss as to what to do with herself now that she had cleaned and tidied the entire house. Bradley was out at work again for the day, and she was going to have to get used to these long days alone. She had spotted socks in need of darning, and the blanket on Bradley's bed was also in need of attention, so she gathered them up and took them out onto the porch, along with a sewing kit she had found in a drawer. Around mid-morning, she looked up to see a lady approaching the porch where she was busy with her needlework, a task which she was finding much more difficult than when other people did it. She laid the sewing down carefully and stood, smiling at the lady as she climbed the few steps. "Hello, you must be Eleanor?" the lady inquired, a smile on her pretty face as she swept her red hair from her eyes. "I sure am. Hello, it's so nice to have a visitor," Eleanor replied honestly, very glad for the distraction that would take her attention from sewing. "My name is Amy Spencer. My husband, David, works with Bradley in the mine. Your husband now, I guess." Eleanor flinched, assuming the woman was criticizing their way of meeting. Looking her in the eyes, though, she found that that couldn't seem further from the truth, and she seemed genuinely happy for the two. "I am so glad to see he has found a lovely wife. He deserves to be happy." "Thank you, Amy. Can I offer you coffee?" Eleanor asked, feeling comfortable with this lady already. "I never say no to a coffee." She laughed and followed Eleanor into the kitchen whilst she prepared it. "Wow, you have been busy in here. The place looks and smells delightful," she exclaimed. Eleanor laughed and explained that she had spent her first day giving the place a little spring clean. They took their coffee out onto the porch and sat together, sipping and chatting about their lives. Eleanor discovered that Amy was 29 years old and that she and her husband had 2 children together, a boy aged 9 and a girl aged 7. She explained that the children were both at school during the day, so she was often a little lost for things to do. Eleanor could empathize with that, and she had only been there for 2 days, she thought. "So, how are you settling in? That's all I came to ask, really. Not to tell you my life story," she quipped, and Eleanor knew she and Amy would get along very well. Eleanor considered simply saying she was fine so as not to trouble her new friend, but decided to be honest. "Actually, I do have one slight problem," she confessed. "I can't cook." Amy looked confused, so Eleanor continued. "I never learned, just didn't get around to it. And now I am so out of my depth. Bradley has helped me the last 2 evenings, but I can't keep letting him do that after he's been working all day," she explained. Tears sprung to her eyes, and she tried to make them go away by blinking. She didn't want her new friend to see her cry, but she felt so weak and incapable as a wife. "Now, that I can help you with," Amy declared confidently as she placed a kind and caring hand on Eleanor's arm. "Finish up your coffee and let's head to my house, just across the way there." She pointed to the house identical to theirs just across the street and the one closest to them. Amy spent the rest of the day teaching Eleanor how to cook a variety of meals and showing her shortcuts to make the task easier. Eleanor was so grateful and thanked Amy many times. She finally felt better able to cook for her husband without his help. With even more thanks, Eleanor left Amy with just enough time for her to get home and create one of the dishes they had practiced. Prosody rate %. Amy had tried to insist she take the meal home with her that they had made together, but Eleanor wanted to prepare the evening meal all by herself. Since they had used only Amy's ingredients earlier, she didn't want to take advantage. Once home, Eleanor put her newfound knowledge and skills to the test and prepared a hearty broth. When Bradley opened the door, the aroma must have consumed him immediately. "Oh my goodness, what is that heavenly smell?" he stated kindly as he walked in. He was filthy after a day in the mine, which had clearly taken its toll, leaving him looking exhausted. "I have made a broth for dinner. Now get washed up and ready," she exclaimed, as she gently patted his hand away from the pot of broth in which he had been about to put a finger. They both laughed, and Bradley retreated to the stove where he collected the pot of hot water to wash with in his room to prepare for dinner. They ate together around the table as they had the previous 2 evenings. It felt good to Eleanor to already have created some sort of routine, and they enjoyed their meal with the bread she and Amy had baked that afternoon. She had not passed up the offer of taking that home, and it smelt divine and tasted even better. Eleanor told Bradley about her day and how Amy had been kind enough to give her some lessons in cooking. He listened, genuinely interested in what she had to say. She then listened to him regale the happenings of his day. She didn't fully understand everything he told her, but she nodded appropriately and asked questions when she really couldn't understand. He seemed to like the questions and answered them succinctly. When Bradley finished the last of his meal, he pushed his bowl aside and patted his stomach, declaring it the best feast that had ever passed his lips. She was sure it wasn't, but she enjoyed the compliment nonetheless. Eleanor stood to move the dishes to the sink to be washed. Bradley joined her with his bowl in hand and thanked her again with a gentle kiss on her lips. Shivers went down her spine as she savored the moment. He quickly apologized and stepped away, ever the gentleman. Eleanor wanted to tell him it was all right by her and that he was welcome to kiss her, but she didn't want him to think badly of her, so she simply smiled at him as he sauntered back to the table to finish his coffee. Chapter 14. The previous 2 weeks had been truly wonderful. Eleanor loved being a wife, and now that she knew how to cook, she was beginning to really enjoy planning and preparing their meals. She had seen Amy a few times a week, and she was grateful for the tips on household chores. Amy even helped her with her sewing, which had come to a stop on the day Amy had first introduced herself. Eleanor had not returned to the task until Amy had offered her help. She started to really enjoy running a home and wondered why people chose to have cooks and maids at all. In the evenings and on weekends, she and Bradley enjoyed taking walks together, chatting with ease while they walked. It was during these walks that Eleanor began to open up a little more with Bradley, and she told him how she missed her mother, but that she was not able to make contact. "But why wouldn't she want you to write to her?" he asked, oblivious to what she had escaped. "My stepfather is not a good man. The day after I made my escape to be with you, he had arranged for me to be married to one of his business associates as part of a business deal," Eleanor admitted honestly, hoping he would not think badly of her for running away. "Oh, Eleanor, that is truly awful," he said as he stopped walking, faced her and took her hands in his. His eyes brimmed with tears at her admission. "But didn't you say it was your mother's idea for you to look in the matrimonial times?" he asked cautiously. "Yes, she didn't want me to be forced into a marriage, especially with someone so much older. She helped me to get away, to come to you. But in return, I had to pretend she had nothing to do with it. So I left a letter to her apologizing for letting her down. I didn't mention where I was going, just that I couldn't go along with my stepfather's business deal." She explained carefully, tears openly streaming down her face. "But now, I don't know if we got away with it. I don't even know if my mother is safe. He can be a very angry and sometimes violent man." "I cannot abide bullies," Bradley exclaimed. "I am so happy you were able to escape that, and that your mother did what she could to help you to be with me. I will take care of you now, you don't need to worry. And soon you will be able to write to your mother, so you will at least have contact. Thank you for telling me. I was a little worried you might think badly of me for leaving my mother and for not sticking to my side of my stepfather's business deal," she admitted as he wiped tears from her cheek. "Not at all. Please never worry about anything like that. I will always be on your side. I am a real husband, not someone like your stepfather," he stated, much to her relief. She was not at all surprised, knowing that she really knew Bradley now, and that he was a good man through and through. Now that she had shared her secrets with Bradley, it felt as though they grew closer with each day. They talked about everything that had happened in their lives, sharing their innermost feelings. Bradley spoke so eloquently about his parents and the time of their passing that Eleanor cried for him as he told her, knowing the pain he must have felt, and still did to a lesser degree. Bradley was refreshingly open and honest about his feelings, letting her know that she had already changed his life for the better in such a short time. The atmosphere between them was becoming increasingly intimate, and Eleanor wondered when it would be time for them to share a bedroom. Chapter 15. Eleanor and Amy sat on the porch with their coffee and chatted the morning away, as had become part of their routine every Monday. Eleanor was so relieved to have made a friend, especially one like Amy, who was so easy to talk to and on whom she could rely. They had seen each other a great deal over the previous weeks, and Eleanor had met her husband David and their children. They had all spent some time together over the weekends, and Eleanor had truly enjoyed and treasured that time. They heard whistling in the distance, and Eleanor looked at Amy, who paled before her eyes and quickly jumped to her feet. The whistling was coming from the direction of the mine. "Amy, what is it? Are you all right?" Eleanor asked, getting to her feet, instinctively knowing something bad had happened going by her friend's ashen face. "There has been a fall at the mine. That's what the whistling indicates," Amy tried to explain. "A fall? Surely a fall can't be too bad?" Eleanor asked naively. "That whistle means that some of the men are likely to be trapped in the mine following the fall." Amy expanded her explanation, and Eleanor's heart began to race. "Trapped? But they will get out, won't they?" she asked, panic beginning to rise in the pit of her stomach. "Let's hope so. Usually, I and most of the other wives go over to the mine to wait for them to get out. Do you want to come?" she asked, but Eleanor was already on her way to get her outdoor shoes on. As they walked to the end of the dirt track from Eleanor's house, she could see the gathering of women nearest the road. She had met a number of them by now, but there were new faces among them. She stayed close to Amy as the army of women marched to the entrance of the mine and stood outside. Some of the women were lucky to spot their husbands shortly after they had arrived, and there were many happy reunions filled with relief, including between Amy and her David. Eleanor was happy for the women who had been blessed to have their husbands safely in their arms, but she couldn't see Bradley anywhere. When David began to approach Eleanor, she knew Bradley must be among the miners who were trapped. She shook her head in disbelief, not wanting to hear his words. Amy pulled her close and embraced her like her mother would be doing had she been there. "I'm sorry, Eleanor, but he is down there in the mine. He and 4 other miners. He went back to help them when he heard their cries. I tried to stop him, but he was determined not to leave them there." Eleanor thought that sounded typical of Bradley, always putting everyone else first. She admired that quality in him, but just this once, she wished he had put himself first. "We are working as quickly as we can to get to them," David said before he returned to his work. Amy looked grief-stricken for Eleanor, which made her wonder if there was any hope of the men getting out, getting her Bradley out. She had known it could be dangerous work, but she had never anticipated this. As the night drew in and they were left in darkness, Amy insisted Eleanor return to their house with her. David would stay at the mine and bring news as soon as there was any. She was reluctant, but there was little else to do. Eleanor wanted to be in her own home, so she crossed the street to sit on the chair on the porch whilst she awaited news. She stared into the night, looking for any sign of David or any of the miners heading back. She couldn't sleep and knew she would not even try. So she stayed on the porch until she decided to take a short stroll to the local church where she prayed for Bradley's safe return. Eleanor then made her way back to the home they shared, where she again sat on the porch with a blanket around her shoulders, waiting for news. She wished she had stayed at the mine, but she knew she would be in the way there and that Amy had needed to get back to her children. Chapter 16. As the sun rose, Eleanor pulled herself out of the rocking chair on the porch and stretched her limbs. She had been sitting still for a long time, but the long-awaited news had not come. She was beginning to feel very worried about what was to happen. She had allowed herself to consider that Bradley might not get out of the mine. Being awake all night had given her too much time to allow her imagination to get the better of her. She quickly freshened up and then set off to Amy's to let her know she was headed back to the mine. By dawn, she was at the entrance with Amy by her side, her arm around her waist in support. Eleanor was thankful again to have Amy as a friend, someone who truly understood the anguish and worry. She wondered how many times Amy had been through this in the years that her David had been a miner, but she dared not ask her that just now. She needed to stay positive. Suddenly, a shout rang out. Eleanor couldn't decipher what had been said, and so she looked to Amy, who explained that they had all been found safe and sound and were on their way out. Eleanor felt her knees buckle, and she would have fallen to the ground had Amy not been holding her up. Finally, Bradley emerged from the mine, dirty and tired. He shook hands with his rescuers and with each of the men he had been trapped with, all of whom thanked him for his help. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears as he looked around and spotted her. She fell into his arms as he neared her, and she asked him to kiss her again, as he had on the night that she had cooked for him. It was a long-awaited kiss, but he took her in his arms and they sealed their love with a kiss. When they finally made it back to their home, Bradley held Eleanor in his arms, telling her over and over that he was all right and that he would not leave her. They both proclaimed their love for each other and agreed it was time for them to share a bedroom. Eleanor marveled at how potential tragedy had brought them closer. They had been heading in that direction already, but something so worrying had made them both realize just how much the other meant to them. All I could think about when I was down there was how I haven't had enough time with you. We haven't had the chance to do all the things we wanted to do. We haven't had children together. We haven't built a bigger home. We haven't had a life together yet. It gave me the strength to get through it and to not give up, he admitted to her that night when they lay in each other's arms. Weren't you scared? Eleanor asked him. He had shown only strength through it all, whereas she had cried a million tears for a man she had almost lost. I was at times, but I kept the faith. I felt your love, and I knew it was not over for us, so I carried on digging our way out. Before I knew it, I dug a path directly to David, who had been digging with some of the other guys from the other side, he explained. But that's the nature of my work. Sometimes this happens, and I'm sorry that it does, because I know it will always be the same for you. That feeling of dread that I might not come back, but know I will always do everything I can to get back to you. He kissed her gently. I love you. She whispered as sleep enveloped her, and her eyes began to finally close after a long few days. She felt his arm reach under her head as he pulled her into him, and her head rested on his bare chest. I love you too. Epilogue. It was mid-afternoon. A knock sounded on Eleanor's door. Her hands were covered in flour as she was baking the bread she so loved making. She shouted for them to come in, assuming it would be Amy popping over for a coffee before the children came home from school. I don't know how you always get the bread so fluffy, Amy, but I will keep trying until I get it exactly how you. A voice interrupted her. Eleanor, came the familiar voice. She spun around to face the doorway. It was her mother. Eleanor could not believe her eyes. She forgot all about the flour on her hands and ran into her mother's arms. They cried together, finally reunited after so many months. Eleanor had written to her mother, but had received no reply. She still thought of her every single day, wondering about her life with Donald. Any chance of a coffee? Her mother asked. It's been one heck of a journey, she exclaimed, a smile on her beautiful face as she looked at her daughter with pride. Eleanor glanced towards the door to make sure Donald was not behind her. She reassured her he was not and promised to tell her everything once she had a coffee in her hands. She was cold and tired after her journey. They sat together in the kitchen, each holding a steaming coffee, when Elizabeth explained why Donald was not with her. Donald is dead, she said without emotion and with no sign of grief, which was no wonder after all the man had put her through. Eleanor could see the wounds of injuries left by beatings, and she felt no sympathy or grief for his departure. He fell down the stairs almost a month ago. He was always drinking too much, she stated coldly, and Eleanor wondered if he had fallen or if there had been more to it. She asked no questions, for whatever death he had suffered was of his own making. She was sure of that. I wrote to you. I was so worried when I never heard back. I was very careful what I put in the letter, so I knew I hadn't incriminated you, Eleanor said, tears filling her eyes as she allowed herself to accept that her mother was with her again. I only found the letter after Donald died. It was in his bedside locker. He had opened and read it, but he never showed it to me, she confided. I knew then that I needed to come to you, to find you. I remembered that you gave me Bradley's address, and I had hidden it very carefully, so I dug it out, and here I am. The two women now held each other's hands across the table and smiled, neither quite believing that they were with the other. "So, what will happen now? Is this just a visit? Do you have to go back home?" Eleanor asked, wondering what she would have to go back to and hoping she would say that she would stay. "I have instructed the lawyers to sell the house. I don't want to be in that place. I would rather have the money. At least then Donald would have been good for something. So, I was wondering, hoping that I could stay here in Thunder Valley with you and Bradley." "Oh, Mother, of course. Nothing would make me happier. I have told Bradley everything, and I know he will be delighted to meet you and have you stay for as long as you would like. I know the house seems small, but you will soon get used to that," Eleanor reassured her. It was lucky she had just finally got around to moving all her belongings into their shared bedroom so that they now had room for her mother to stay too, she thought. They spent the rest of the afternoon catching up over coffee. Eleanor told her mother about how wonderful Bradley was and mentioned the recent panic when he was stuck down the mine. Elizabeth had been sorry she hadn't been there to support her at that time, but was glad she had a good friend who was able to do that for her. When the door opened, Eleanor realized suddenly that she had nothing ready for dinner, as she had been partway through preparations when her mother arrived and had not gone back to it. She jumped up to greet her husband. "Hello there, how was your day?" she asked, but then burst in with information about her own day before he even had a chance to answer. "Look, my mother's here," she exclaimed as she grabbed his shoulders and turned him in the direction to see her. "My goodness, Mrs. Seymour, welcome. I am so happy to finally meet you. I have heard so much about you." He held out his hand to her as Elizabeth approached him. "Never mind that, son. Come here," she replied as she wrapped him in a warm embrace. Eleanor knew that would have meant the world to Bradley, having lost his own parents and still missing them so much. "You two chat whilst I finish dinner, if that's all right?" Eleanor suggested, and they both nodded their agreement, although Bradley shot off to wash up and change his clothes. "Oh, Eleanor, he seems perfect," Elizabeth stated when she knew he was out of earshot. "I can't even tell you just how perfect. Honestly, I am so happy, and I know you will be too," she replied, and they embraced before he returned, and Eleanor prepared dinner, proud that she was able to cook. Bradley and Elizabeth chatted for a while, and moments before dinner was ready, he jumped up and said he would be back in a moment. He left them feeling rather puzzled as he walked out the kitchen door and into the cold and dark night. A few minutes later, he returned with a wooden chair that matched the ones at the kitchen table. "I gave the spare one to David and Amy when my folks passed away. They didn't need it for tonight," he explained. "But they have invited themselves over to meet you after dinner, Mrs. Seymour. I hope that is all right?" he asked cautiously. "Of course, I can't wait to meet the people who have been looking after my daughter for me. But please, Bradley, call me Elizabeth, or even Mother if you like. I don't want to hear the name Seymour again for as long as I live," she said, and they all laughed. They ate their meal together and chatted as if they had done this every day. "I cannot believe you have made this meal all by yourself," Elizabeth declared as she finished the last of the food on her plate. "I wouldn't have a clue where to start," she added. Bradley looked at Eleanor, confusion across his face, and she knew why. "I know I let you believe Mother did all of the cooking, but in reality, we had a cook and a maid. So we have never needed to know how to do any of that, and that's why I was so poorly prepared when I arrived. That's why Amy gave me lessons in pretty much everything." Eleanor smiled at him triumphantly, proud of herself for learning so much when she had felt it was impossible at first. They all laughed and praised her cooking once more before they removed the plates, and Bradley opened the door to let David know they were ready for them to come over. They had a jovial evening, chatting and sharing stories, although they were careful to avoid mentioning the evil stepfather. Bradley stood up and stated that he had wine with which to toast this happy occasion. Eleanor gathered the glasses and Bradley poured and handed everyone a glass. "A toast to families and friends coming together and being there for each other," he said as he clinked his glass with those around him, as did everyone else. "And," Eleanor began quietly, "a toast to growing families, she said, her eyes filling with tears as she gestured towards her stomach. Are you? Are we? Bradley asked, his eyebrows arched into a question as Eleanor nodded that yes, indeed, they were expecting their first child.